going to do another follow-up video to my new Albion video on some theories about Port Jackson, maybe. But now I've moved on, and I come to the conclusion I don't know, but I wanted to go through some musings. So I want to start off with a map by Antonio Zata, which was done around the 1770s, and it's got like it's basically Captain Cook's map. Apparently that's been revamped and includes the Captain Cook journey. And the main thing, and obviously we're expected to believe that this is the best map of the time, based on the 1770 map of Cook. And the main things I want to just demonstrate is that we have the main two ports that is only ever mentioned, as far as I can tell, on any of Cook's maps, and that is Port Stephens and Port Jackson. And I did think that they were already ports and they were already called Port Stephens and Port Jackson, but they may not have been. They may have been ports, but with different names, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The idea that there's been a lot of concerns about and speculation that maybe Cook had based his charts on previous work. So there's a whole, this is on Wikipedia and you can find this. This is the theory of Portuguese discovery of Australia, which includes Spanish. The theory goes on and on and on, and in every single possible thing, and it talks about the famous Dieppe maps or big Java maps, which is dubious. That could be a form of cartography that's propaganda, like fake map making, so to distract people from the discovery. That's another idea, that the maps are deliberately fake. But so much is written about Cook that you'll read all about it in many sources, is that people think that he already had prior knowledge. He went into certain bays and thought that it was different to what he thought. He talks in his notes how he says, this was different to what I thought it was, so referring to the fact that he was probably already knew about these harbors that he was sailing up and down the coast. And like, there's lots of academic scholarship on this. Is from Hunter, Living Histories. This is a whole discussion about his charts. There's two charts, two publication dates. One has apparently a small, tiny island not on it, and then on the later published one, there's a tiny island that is on it. You can look at all the comments and all of these things, and there's a huge amount of discourse on it. But basically, the idea is that people think that he didn't even sail into Port Jackson. He just went past it, and someone even thinks that. So you can look online and look for the whole thing about Cook's maps being tainted or being have notes like New South Wales being written in different type font after the official publication date and things like that. So you can look that his maps are essentially fake. All right, so going back on it, so that's just Cook, and that puts a timestamp around the 1770s where people think that he used earlier charts from some earlier date. We don't know. Okay, so this is from 1644-ish, and there's multiple maps in the 1600s, all looking similar to this. They all have this, they all cover the west. This is all Dutch maps, generally. And you've got New Guinea, and you've got the Cape here that we know, Carpentaria, but you don't have anything over here. You have all this, it all gets murky, and there's multiple maps of all the era that shows the same kind of thing. So that doesn't change too much. I think this map's from the 1700s, actually. Okay, this map is by Hendrik de Leth, around about the 1730s. There's many variations of this map. This is of particular interest, and this carries on from the Dutch genre of having the whole west coast. It has Pacific Islands. Um, like if you look here, it's got the Pacific. These islands are actually that's like an expansion. It's not actually what they think it is. It's got New Guinea separated. It has a bit more information on here, and it has New Zealand down here, and it has Van Diemen's Land here. So it's more information, and this is quite an interesting map. And I'll go into more detail. What it is, trying to reconcile what this is. This is the Gulf of Carpentaria. It's supposed to come around and go down, and now I'm looking at what they think is the Terra de Key, or however you pronounce it, but that's referring to what they think is the Terra Australis, or Australia. They think that there's an Australia here, and that's why they're roughing in the roughing it in here, thinking it's there. But what's particularly strange is that you have Solomon Islands. It's got a reference here, but you've got other islands here, and you've got Isla Isabella. That's on quite a few maps, this strange island called Isabel Island. What is really interesting is Port de la Vraie Croix, Port of the True Cross, I think it is. Port de la Vraie. Well, I can't pronounce it, sorry. And the second port is Port de Saint Philip. When I originally thought of this, I said, well, what are these ports? Because this map was supposed to be in the 1700s. I then tried to work out if there's any reference to these two ports. I thought that could have been loosely Port de Saint Philip was Port Jackson, and the Vraie or Croix, whatever you pronounce it, is Port Stephens. And I don't think that's the case anymore. But I did briefly think that, and I was curious about Isle Isabella. Now that's quite when you go to the maps today and you zoom out, you get the familiar ocean base where you have this sort of these islands around this sort of subterranean landmass, so to speak, and you have the Solomon Islands here, and you have Saint Isabel Island. So that's obviously the Isabella Island on these maps. And I would imagine that there were ports along here that would have been undocumented, and that's why you have a map here with two ports. They're no longer there, but they're not from Australia. They're probably around New Caledonia or perhaps Solomon Islands, and they're no longer there. But when I was looking up the names of these places, I can't actually find anything where these names come from. They tend to be the closest thing I can find for names of similar place names, like Saint Philip or the Vraie Croix or Cross, is Brittany. So Brittany has a place of that same place name, and Saint Philip, there's a church or something down here somewhere. So we're talking about northwest and western France as the possible locations, and so it got me thinking that perhaps this is a French initiative. All right, so that sent me down to another question as I started to research potential French expansion into the Pacific. There was an article written in the early 1900s by Marguerite Ayer. She is not highly referenced. She did quite a bit of work as an academic, and what's particularly interesting is that when you read through this, she goes on about Buccaneers and the skin trade. She goes on that the Pacific was opened up by the French and Portuguese, which is consistent with a lot of other alternative theories that the Spanish and Portuguese. The Spanish and Portuguese opened up the Pacific. They did a skin trade. There was a lot of activity going across the Pacific to China, I believe. This is not well documented, but it is documented. And then the French wanted to get in on it, and it looks like they were trying to get in on it at a roughly around about the late 1600s. But it gives you. But what I'm trying to say is that you just start reading this. It says here, for example, the first French expedition financed by the Crown set sail for the South Seas in 1695. And Le Comte de Jenner, I don't know how to pronounce it, had listened to the stories of the Buccaneer Mazurti and persuaded the Crown to undertake a voyage. All right. So no matter what you read, when you start looking at academic papers 100 years ago, they say something like Buccaneer Mazurti, right? Or who's that? And you look online, I've looked everywhere, there's no record of that Buccaneer, right? It doesn't. So I don't know anything about it, right? And in terms of other Buccaneers, there's only so much information on them. So you had a whole bunch of trade going on in the late 1600s and 1700s with Buccaneers financing it and making a lot of money. Where you go, well, who are they? I mean, where's the information on it? So, and now we start getting a bit of a window into the fact is that if they had a lot of money and they were renegade, they needed somewhere to start to settle, to use their finances to start setting up a life for themselves, their own independent, lands, let's say. And and the French got in and tried to get in on it in the 1700s. And this is a bit more detailed. It goes into the same sort of genre, and I think it's from the early 1700s again. Actually, I'm not sure. I forgot. Actually, it could be the 1600s. But anyway, I can't remember the name of the person who did it, and you can look up online. It's got the island of Isabel again. It has all this land with these names that I can't match up. These are the Solomon Islands. So Isabel is part of the Solomon Islands. So it's very alike, and I can't find those ports that I mentioned earlier. So I don't know where they are. So what I'm thinking is that going back to the main map of interest, looking at just in the place names, there's some Spanish or Portuguese. There's certainly some, and these names most likely were probably French. I mean, just those two ports there. And if this is done in the 1730s, and if you go back to the map here, and this is a Cook's map, this is a version of Cook's map from 1776-ish, based on 1770, but we think that it's based on earlier works, then we now have a window where somewhere between 1730 and 1769, charts are made of the east coast of Australia that included two ports where Cook named Port Stephens and Port Jackson, but were probably named something else. And it's between that period of time where we would have had stragglers or buccaneers or retired buccaneers or retired traders or people trying to escape the conflict. And we don't have any record of any interim maps between this map here and this map here. But there's a gap of about 40 years or something between the two. And everything changed, but we don't know what it is. But we do have a window. And so now we can hone down closer into what it could possibly have been. Now, there's one obvious thing, is that if the charts were based on Dutch sources, and some of those Dutch sources were wiped out, we do have the obvious Anglo-Dutch wars, and we've obviously they've always had tensions between the British and the Dutch anyway, irrespective of whether there was a war or not. And you had the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, 1780 to 1784, so there would have been lost documentation in the victory of the British, I'm assuming, taking over some of the trade routes, and that would have taken some of the charts that were probably unpublished, and that would probably explain why there's no charts, because there would have been a conquest. And that's probably the most likely thing. So we now have to figure out where to find information, to where do we actually, I mean, how are we going to actually find out through the academic record any hint of which powerful privateers were profiting during this time and had enough finances to potentially set up trade routes, most likely um, reviewed or adopted by the Dutch for a brief period, and most likely would have been traded further up to um, Singapore or something like that. So yeah, there's more research to do, a lot more, and but at the very least, if you're a historian, that's you should actually figure out why there's two ports here, just south of the Solomon Islands. They don't have any record that I can find. I don't know what they are, and that in itself means is that there is a cover up of history because you've got two ports there that should be on the record, on the official record somewhere. That these two ports alone. So if you're into alternative history Australia, that's great, but alternative history Pacific Ocean would be just as valid an enterprise, and to invest your time into, because you'll probably find there's rabbit holes going into lost ports and lost trade routes that will be wiped out of history, which would then give us a better perspective and also help us understand what trade routes would have potentially financed the inception of some of the pre-British colonists that I suspect were already moving into Port Jackson, Port Stephens, uh, uh, Port Phillip, Port Dalrymple, which is Launceston, and of course South Australia, which I think was being already started to get intensified in the late 1700s, just prior to the official narrative of their inception dates of between 1788 and 1820, 1830-ish, roughly. So that's it. Thanks very much.